Recording. Yeah, all right. Thank
Okay,
you.
very good. And Jan, just one final sound check. Are we good on my voice and on the screen?
Yes,
Okay, very good. Well, again, welcome everyone. And as Jan said, my name is Walt Majerowitz, and I am a somewhat recently retired consultant. Spent a lot of time on my own over the last I don't know, 8 or 9 years, supporting a variety of organizations. But my history before that was primarily with NASA and supporting various NASA programs and projects in those areas that Jan mentioned. But I'll leave that to my short bio that I believe was listed with the meeting announcement. I'd like to dive right in. And so today's topic, scheduling ethics, recognizing gaming, data manipulation, and abuse in project schedules, is one that kind of takes a look at this whole area of ethics in project management. And this is based on some earlier work that I did, and like to give you a feel for what we're referring to here. And so I'll be flipping through the slides. I guess the purpose basically is to sort of create that awareness among project practitioners about the potential for scheduled gaming. And I'll use that term gaming to really bundle up these different things, data manipulation and abuse and so forth in the scheduling area. Hopefully highlight some of the practices that can adversely impact projects and their success, and also examine some strategies that we might use or consider to mitigate these, these practices. Now, this session does assume you have a sort of a basic knowledge of CPM, critical path method-based scheduling. We're also sort of a survey, kind of a top-level view of this. We could easily dive down deeply into any one of these subtopics, but why don't we press on and just take a look at the ethics dimension of the topic. We'll look at some of the practices and then get into some of the areas of how we might mitigate this concern. I might also mention that a lot of the things we see here today, while relating to schedule, could relate to other disciplines as well. Risk management, earned value management. These areas are subject to the potential for what we're referring to as gaming. The point two is that I don't think we're looking at this rampant problem, this excessive, ongoing, constant issue with scheduling ethics. However, based on my experience and my observation, there are situations that do occur that can develop, which having an awareness of what some of these potential concerns are in terms of scheduled gaming could be beneficial to you and your project and those of your project stakeholders. A lot of organizations have I guess, a code of ethics, a professional conduct. I did use this one from the Project Management Institute, and we see terminology and words like deceive, misleading, false statements, and this is troubling if these kinds of things occur, and we're going to look specifically at how they may occur in a scheduling environment and what that could entail. And we're also not necessarily talking about errors. I mean, errors occur in any discipline, but we're talking about conscious decisions that are made to manipulate and game schedule data and schedules in a manner that is really not to the benefit of the project or its success. Now, over the years, I've sort of collected some thoughts and statements that I've picked up along the way from various project practitioners that I think kind of help say in their own words some of these some of the background about scheduled gaming. And that first one, which I've had for quite some time, has always troubled me, that where the program manager specifically pointed out that that the organization sort of has to lie, has to fib, has to fudge the cost and schedule. Otherwise, projects wouldn't be approved. They would not have the business. They would not be able to go and deploy the great systems that institution was responsible for. So could there be another way? Also, at the working level, here a project scheduler not too long ago stating that whenever he or she sees a schedule metric, the first thing that they consider is how do you game it? How can you work around it, get around it? And that too is somewhat troubling. For those that may have some involvement with the probabilistic side of schedule risk analysis, that here's just a note from a previous independent analysts that could basically say, well, I'll give you any answer you want. And that sort of takes away from that independent view of the schedule and the schedule analysis, where if that person felt under pressure to produce a certain outcome. The last one there, this is somewhat of a composite quote. In some courses I taught over the years to product leads or control account managers, a common theme would come up about how for their schedules and their cost estimates too, they would be under pressure to reduce them. Perhaps, well, not perhaps, but specifically artificially. And so their thought was that, well, maybe we have to adjust those on our own. We have to pad those schedules in order to kind of ultimately settle to where we want to be. Just a couple of more briefly in the risk dimension of scheduling. We might be all familiar with the 5x5 risk matrix or risk chart. In one instance, not long ago, a project manager would basically report the standard reporting up through the channels with the 5x5 risk chart. But the real story was, in terms of his schedule risks, were kind of kept inside. He kept those to himself. And the issue there being that other stakeholders would not be able to weigh in and understand those risks, possibly even contribute to their mitigation or resolution. So they stay burning in the background, causing potential problems. And so there are some others that I list there as well. And then jumping even to the last one, that here we have a calculation of the slack associated with the critical path on a particular project, which the project manager simply didn't care for and directed his scheduler to change, find another way. Let's report it this month and deal with it later. All, in my judgment, in my experience, somewhat troubling conditions. And so we begin to ask ourselves, well, why game the schedule? And that may be to hide problems. Perhaps we want to divert attention from the true critical path for some reason or another. We may want to protect our schedule margin. And this is one that we'll get into by an example a little bit later, very important. Avoiding variance explanations. Let's just not spend time with that. Let's just put that out of the way. And even more troubling, obscuring the schedule in the hope that a change will come along that we can sort of recover from a problem that may have occurred. And so to manipulate the schedule in that way. Of course, win new business, put the schedule in the best possible light, whether it's realistic or not. We'll save that for another day once we win the job. Maybe we want to keep management off our backs. You know, we don't need your help. We'll figure it out, hopefully, but maybe more often than not. Finally, there's this overall sometimes desire to avoid budget cuts, keep the project alive. Let's eliminate the negative findings to get through to the next phase of the project. And so there's a concealment factor that could occur. Now, again, not this rampant problem I've constantly saw on all the projects I've ever worked, but saw enough of it to raise the question and just acquaint the community here today with some of the potential for these types of areas of schedule ethics and abuse. Some of the contributing factors, certainly what kind of organization dealing with that we're either in or perhaps our suppliers are associated with? Does it encourage the reporting of potential bad news or problems or risks? Or are those carriers of that information, are they punished? And so there's the cultural factor. You know, optimism is a good thing in my view, but over optimism to the point where something such as a schedule forecast is unrealistic, I think that could be a real problem. So we have to bear that factor in mind. Some organizations have very good schedule management policies, processes, procedures, and so forth, tools, etc. Others do not. And so where there are not these policies and aspects of things in place to help guide the organization and the projects, they're left to their own devices and they have to define the requirements themselves in many cases and or make them up. And so we may not fully have a complete story of what exactly is going on from a schedule perspective in terms of development and reporting and analysis. We talked about the example earlier of the PMI Code of Ethics. The point here is, what is the tone at the top of the organization, whether that's the project, the program office, the overall company or lab or what have you? What is the tone there with leadership in terms of the importance of ethical behavior in all disciplines? And of course, today we're looking at schedule. I'm a big advocate of independent review, spent a lot of time in that area where there is a third party, an outside view of how the project is doing. And so that lack of that independent review or that oversight, if you will, can perhaps shortchange the project in terms, and the organization in terms of their awareness of these potential abuses and gaming of project schedules. Now, in terms of some of the consequences, eventually these types of things that we'll talk about and illustrate in a few minutes could contribute to completion delays. We'll be late. And of course, we've got the idea that as the schedule goes, so goes the cost. And so we could see cost overruns as well. Neither a good thing for the project, for the organization. If things like critical paths are manipulated, that they're incorrect or misleading, that could lead to the misallocation of resources, especially when there are other stakeholders or organizations that are involved and depending on the accuracy of the schedule data that's reported. We could get into erroneous forecasts and ultimately estimates to complete that our data is suspect, and we may have problems down the road in areas of the project, if not the whole project itself. The reduced loss of stakeholder, I guess, credibility, or stakeholder impacts rather, loss of trust, credibility, these kinds of things can be impacts as well, more qualitative, that if an organization has to resort to gaming in order to get through the next month or the next review or some other aspect, then that is troubling. That is an aspect of attention and devotion of resources that could be used better elsewhere. We may lose insight into our suppliers, into our contractors and partners, especially when there's a not so pleasant relationship between the two parties, which happens quite often, or at least it has in my experience. You know, in the past, if we have situations where verbal direction is given to a supplier or a contractor, and they implement that direction, and the contracting officer comes along and basically shuts down any aspect of fee associated with that additional work, that it was not documented, that could lead to an atmosphere of fee-bearing schedule delay claims. And so if that relationship is not healthy, then between the two parties, that could lead to gamesmanship that would sort of put an atmosphere conducive to delay claims. So we would not want to see that. We hopefully would not see the delays at all. If we can now turn our attention to some of the specific practices, this is where I'll show some examples. Like to go through some categories next of the type of things that are affiliated with schedule gaming, data manipulation, and abuse. And I have examples that follow, though not necessarily for all of these categories. We'll try to cover which ones we can. But first of all, this area we refer to as preferential sequencing. And this is where, in the case of the logic network-based integrated master schedule, that the logic can be structured or adjusted or manipulated in a way that could essentially favor one stakeholder's position or interest over another. And so we'll see an example of that in just a minute. So this aspect of sort of, preferring something over something else could come into play. Duration padding, we know that in our activities and our schedule, we need a good duration estimate, but maybe it is helpful, some would say, to add an artificial buffer into place or into the duration just in case. But one has to ask oneself that, well, what if everybody did that? And is it even valid? Why do that? Why not just a realistic estimate to start with, and these kinds of things? So we saw the example or the illustration earlier of the quote from one of the product leads or a group of product leads about their desire to pad their schedule because it's going to get cut. So a lot of potential problems going on there. On the other hand, there's the compression of the duration or the reduction of task durations to offset late or slipping predecessor tasks or activities. And so we may be late on certain things, and then to make up for that, we'll just take the time out of the future tasks and worry about it later. Again, another form, in my judgment, of gaming that ultimately will potentially come out as overrun from a schedule standpoint later as those realistic durations actually come back into place. Slack, Slack as a resource there to use is sometimes hidden in order to make it available if needed later. But why would one want to do that? It's troubling here where we don't have the visibility necessarily into schedule Slack. And so the use of constraints and lags or improper logic in the schedule can hide that slack. And so perhaps the owner of the task or activity will be aware of it, but they'll coordinate these practices to hide that. Abusing logic, we can manipulate or see the manipulation of dependencies to mask issues or problems. I've got a specific example of that. And then leaving things out of the schedule can be problematic as well. We're going to have a nice example a little bit later of schedule margin, probably one of the most visible areas in terms of my experience and projects and schedules, a highly important and just aspect of schedules that get a lot of attention and can have some confusion as well. So we'll come to that one shortly. Resident in our projects, our calendars, are they properly designated, properly used and set up? Because they can be improperly or inappropriately established, which could lead to problems and misuse as well. Frequent rebaselining, another area where instead of trying to get the work done to the plan, we'll just change the plan and move on from there. Task constraints, just using those inappropriately, we'll touch on that. And even an example in just a bit on multiple schedules, which schedule are we working to? There's some potential for problems there as well. The aspect of, is this a schedule that realistically approaches the idea of getting work done, or is this a schedule that's used to win the job or fit the time available, other potential problem. We're not going to get into the performance metrics here, but there are some helpful metrics that are pretty good objective indicators of progress, but those too can be subject to manipulation or abuse, often by ignoring them, by simply not even addressing them. So this has happened time and again in multiple projects that I'm familiar with. There's the qualitative aspect of schedule risk in terms of just ignoring risk candidates, arbitrarily adjusting probabilities and impact scores. And then we also have the simply misrepresenting our schedule status in terms of performance, variances and forecasts, and just withholding known information. So just that conscious step of misrepresentation can be problematic as well. And finally, in terms of the probabilistic or quantitative aspect of schedule risk analysis, that the areas in terms of correlations, probabilities and impact ranges, these are all subject to inputs from sometimes not so objective observers or participants. And so these can be manipulated to perhaps obtain an outcome that's more favorable to a project. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of some of these abuse practices. Again, I want to stress that these can occur. To be aware of them, on the lookout for them, to understand them can be beneficial. In terms of preferential sequencing, now I will point out my examples are very rudimentary and almost cartoonish, but they're kind of meant to illustrate the point rather than use real data. But assume for a moment our project has a number of components for integration, and the government has to provide one. And so we baselined our schedule, and they've agreed that we'll receive that on the front end of the project and integrate our first component. And so we're ready to go. Technically, these components can be integrated in any order, but suppose something happens where, in this case, the government has a problem with that piece of equipment, that component it has to provide, and it impacts the contractor's schedule. If there is a good working relationship, they may be able to work around this problem and perhaps integrate that component later. But in this case, the supplier claims that there's going to be a delay. Government, you are providing an input that we agreed we'd get in the beginning of our project for integration, and it's going to be late, so we're going to roll out and be delayed. So here's the impact of that. Again, if there is a good and healthy working relationship, again, at least in my experience, sometimes these things can be worked out without the problems associated with potential claims and so forth. So this preferential sequencing rather is an area, especially when it involves elements that are being provided to or being received from other organizations. They can have serious implications to the schedule. And so we have to be on the lookout for those. So relating to that is our second category of abusing schedule logic. And I do want to say I am trying to move rather fast. It is quite a bit to cover even at a top level, but to press on with schedule logic, we might have just a little thought quiz here that if our electronics box is single box, we basically build it and test it, we might ask ourselves, well, what logical relationship best illustrates or conveys that dependency between the two activities? And the point here is that there are choices within your scheduling tool as to how to characterize that. And these are well, from the standpoint that we could have hundreds, if not thousands of activities in the schedule that we need to be sure that the correct and proper relationships and dependencies are being conveyed. Now, in this case, I would say that the answer would be A. We can't very well test Airbox until we built it. However, as we'll see in a minute, that may be an area that can be subject to abuse. So let's look at an example. Let's say it's August 10th and we're on track to beat our September 14th delivery date by 3 days. But, and a week later, the engineering department reports that it's going to be late in finishing the design. So here we've got a constraint on our delivery task of September 14th, and we're looking at finishing 3 days earlier on September 11th. Engineering has come along and said, no, we're going to be late. It's going to potentially push our late design will push our delivery out beyond that September 14th commitment. So we've got a potential late delivery. And we know our customer is not going to like this news. So we've got to do something. We've got to turn this schedule in tonight. What might we do? Well, let's just go ahead and make an adjustment here. We'll show our finish, we'll change our finish to start relationship to a finish to finish between the build and test. We'll add a lag in, and that will then restore our date, restore our slack, and everything will be fine, and we'll figure it out next month or next week. Well, that, in my judgment, would be a case of manipulating the schedule. It's artificial. It's not really what is intended to occur. And so if we think of this one example and multiply that across many, many different things that are going on in the schedule, there could be potential problems, especially if you're an organization that has fallen into the trap of performing these kinds of things on the schedule in terms of abuse. And they can be very subtle and they can be very detailed at the same time. If we move on here to duration padding, that's our next category. And in this case, we are talking about how additional duration is simply added to the activity over and above the realistic estimate. So some of the considerations associated with that would be, we want to include a hidden margin. What if stuff takes longer? Well, it just might take longer because we're adding this additional time that's artificial. So we need to be aware of that. But maybe we want to protect ourselves against these challenges or cuts that inevitably come along from our management and our leadership. We are interested in hiding that slack or that float because we'd like to use it later. So let's just pad the duration a little bit. So these are some of the types of considerations to think about. If your builder was telling you sort of artificial estimates for the work to accomplish your house or build your house, or your addition or your home improvement, you probably wouldn't like that too much. You'd want something relatively realistic. And so such is the same with our complex projects. One way potentially around the duration padding problem would be a properly built basis of estimate, and specifically a schedule basis of estimate, or schedule BOE is a technique that might be applied to help mitigate that particular problem at the detail level. And so from a real simple graphical standpoint, in this case, we've added a 10% pad to this portion of the schedule, moving our projected finish out from September 13th to September 25th, adding various implications for cost, for risk potentially. What is the slack associated with this? Is this on the critical path or near the critical path? And is there even a critical path if we're padding our schedule or padding our duration? Other side of the coin is duration compression. This slightly different, where we're looking to compress the durations for our future activities or those that are underway and not finished. Perhaps because of the delays in prior activities. We want to hold the date. We want to still finish on time. Maybe we're just being over optimistic. Maybe we're accepting a management challenge, or we're buying in, or we're just simply fixing the schedule. But where the duration compression is not based on some realistic either workaround or addition of resources or some other aspect, it becomes something of a gaming issue. And so an awareness of this is important. Now, certainly some of our scheduling tools, analytical tools, health checks, comparison tools can help screen out changes that we're talking about in durations and logic and so forth from month to month dates. But they tend to be after the fact, after the gaming has possibly occurred. So we ultimately want to be able to deal with it before that. Here is, and we'll get to that a little later, duration compression example is where we've got the our original baseline for our simple example here, and that we've got the before compression, our August 31st completion date, but we've forecast a 6-day delay. And so we can see there the September 10th date on line 4 is projected beyond our target. So why don't we just remove some duration from downstream, bring things back in, and all is on track. Again, this could be a technique where this is done, think with the project thinking that, you know, we can go ahead and make this change and we'll deal with it next month. We'll figure out how to get rid of this, but we can't show this delay. And so again, the gaming comes in, and the gaming can come back to hurt and haunt the project. Pressing on into the hiding of slack and float, just masking or concealing this could become a problem for us too. And we can use longer than estimated activity durations, as we've just illustrated, or perhaps constraint dates to override things, maybe logic or lags. And so here's a case where we've got our 13 days of total slack relative to our line 5 delivery on September 11th, and there's no lag time in this flow, a nice, neat work sequence. But maybe we want to sort of retain some of that slack. We're not sure. We want to be on the safe side. So let's just put in this 5-day lag, and we'll reduce our slack to 8. We still have some slack. We've kind of hidden this away. And some may argue, well, that's okay. But keeping track of this, why would we do this? What are the implications? Can become a problem. And so in my experience, the sort of the masking, or the hiding rather, of slack can be problematic, especially when it's done on so many different types of activities in the project schedule. Now, a little pop quiz, and I really hesitated putting this chart in, but let's suppose we had the NBT project. It's a government project. A government agency is running this project, and they've got phase 1 and phase 2. And the government project has contracted with a supplier to do the actual work for phase 1 and phase 2. And the supplier has a finish date that's been agreed to, and that's you see that with the one notation, their supplier finish. NBT, the project itself, from its government perspective, has a baseline finish a little later. And then at the program or the agency level, there is a requirement to get the project done even a little bit later. So dates are not so much important as just the view of the time sequencing here. And so what we've got is the case where in the green, the government NBT project manager has established a schedule margin. These are days planned into the schedule. to protect it. So phase 1 has 10 days, phase 2 has 15 days. And this is funded. In other words, it's been priced out, it's been budgeted. There are dollars associated with that time. The yellow box represents a 10-day schedule margin under the control of the supplier. And then, of course, on top of this, we've got 12 days of total slack between our baseline finish date and the required finish. And all this data is pulled together inside one integrated logic network, integrated master schedule for the project. But the question is, how much funded schedule margin should the government NBT project manager report at next week's monthly status review? Is it 25 days? There it is, 10 and 15. Is it 25 or is it 35? Do we put in the contractors? Do I include the slack, 47? Or maybe it's none of these, or maybe it depends. Schedule margin is one of the really big high visibility items in the organizations I'm familiar with. And so this is one where it's also subject to gaming. So in particular, where the organization has specific requirements for schedule margin at different points in time, and if the project happens to fall below those limits, those targets, then there could be a temptation to find margin elsewhere, such as counting the contractor's margin in the government project manager's held margin, or counting the slack as margin, which, as we all know, or hopefully know, is something different. So two different things. So this whole area of schedule margin, very important. In this particular example, from my experience in the organizations I've dealt with most recently, the answer would be 25, because those are the funded days of margin that this particular government project manager can control. One might argue that they indirectly control the supplier held margin, but the organization's policy would state that we do not count that. However, other projects within the same organization do it anyway, or they will count the slack days, or they will count the unfunded weekend days. So it gets very complex very fast in terms of schedule margin in some cases. And that, by the way, is if our project is fortunate to have any schedule margin at all, which is perhaps a discussion for another day. So given that, just some ideas. As we said, this is a high visibility resource controlled by the project manager. We refer to it, or I refer to it, as funded schedule margin in the organizations I'm most recently involved with, because it's been priced and budgeted. Sometimes there are formal requirements for the quantity of the margin, and sometimes there's not. In both cases, it could lead to potential inflation of that margin to show a better picture. And that's what the gaming is all about, to inflate the margin, to indicate a position that may not really be the true case in terms of when we could actually use that margin. Is it really there? Is it funded? So some of these considerations that we talked about, that just to properly account for that and understand that relationship between the subordinate contractor, if there are any, and what the project has to account for. Okay, let's see. And whether there is a policy or procedure or process involved. In the graphic here, if we look up the y-axis, we have taken a count of the early finish date and late finish date, the task finish dates out of our IMS for our various, for our project. And so we also have over time the kind of the cum effect of adding up all of these target completion dates from our schedule. And so in doing our backward pass and forward pass in our logic network, we'll wind up with a set of early dates and late dates and slack in between. And so here in the example, we've got our project start, and then we are completing all of our tasks or planning to complete all of our tasks leading to our project finish. The question is, what do we time phase our performance measurement baseline to? In other words, our budget, to the early dates or to the late dates? Or is it somewhere in between? The area that first got my attention in terms of schedule gaming is this exact topic, because this is a case where a supplier time phased its budget, its PMB, its performance measurement baseline from an earned value perspective to the late date schedule while they work to the early dates. And so this was a case where they're doing two different things. We've got two different schedules. You're not really working to the schedule that you're reporting to. There's a disconnect here. There was clearly, again, in my judgment, a case of gaming. It was the most, I think, contentious issue I think I've run across in this particular body of information or knowledge about schedule gaming. And so it's an area that I just point out that be aware of what is happening along the line of the phasing, the time phasing of the budget relative to the schedule. Now, true, some organizations actually have it in their policy to time phase to the late schedule, to the late dates. But we have to ask ourselves, what is in the best interest of the project? Is there confusion? And if there is, what are we going to do about it? So multiple schedules, work to one plan, report to another, can, in my judgment, be a potential problem area relative to gaming. Just to really try to get through here, because I do want to leave some time for questions and be mindful of your time. We do have situations where hopefully we have accurately accounted for things in our schedule calendar process. So plant shutdowns, holidays, maintenance, and so forth. If we had this simple example, we've got our schedule for our project, and boy, this looks great. We're going to be done on January 15th. But if we look at our calendars, well, gosh, they're across for these activities, they're across the holiday period, November, December, and January, and they're all work days. Is that really realistic? Not sure about your organizations, but in some of the ones that I've been affiliated with, things slow down quite a bit during that period from just a efficiency and productivity standpoint. And if we were to really look at some realistic non-work periods in that time frame, we would see Thanksgiving and Christmas time, plant shutdown, New Year's Day, all of these that would take the January 15th target finish all the way out to January 28th if we properly accounted for project calendars. So what this raises the question about is that, are the calendars being properly used in our schedule? So there's the potential for errors and just perhaps some weak schedule management, but there's also the potential for gaming. So just to make everyone aware of that. Task constraints, I used this last example. This was a real chart from a project, a big software legacy system being replaced. Just very briefly, across the x-axis is the status date from the integrated master schedule. Up the y-axis is the total slack in workdays associated with the delivery of the system, which is represented by the dates. And so as each month passes, we would have seen a date, reported date from the IMS for the completion of the system, delivery of the system, and the associated total slack affiliated with that date. This particular government customer was extremely concerned about seeing the dates move out, seeing the slack erode and actually go negative, and got confused. There was too much data. They were simply getting an IMS, an integrated master schedule, thrown over the wall to them every month, and asking questions about these movement or slippage of dates and loss erosion of slack. And so the supplier did a couple of things. They started to simply remove what they previously had in terms of a hard constraint on the delivery date. And so by definition, the slack would go to zero, even though the date would continue to move out, which it did. And if we move the scale over more to the right, it continued to move out. It sometimes took conveying multiple bits of information about the schedule in one view to help an organization, a customer, a stakeholder understand what was really going on. And what was really going on in this case was that we lost, or the customer lost track of its trend of schedule slack and thought for a while maybe that's okay because it's not negative, but then seeing the dates moved out, that was a problem. And so what we're seeing multiple things go on, this also this disconnection of predecessor logic to the milestone. It's just a multiple set of things. I'm kind of rushing through that one for time, but my point is that there could be a combination or confluence of several of these gaming techniques that wreak havoc on dates, on slack, on margin. And so it's important to be aware of that. And why does that happen? Is there some fundamental issue with the organization doing the work? Very quickly, some gaming strategies recognize that gaming is wrong from a schedule standpoint. Start with your schedulers. These techniques, to become familiar with them, would be very beneficial because they're the ones on the front line that can truly see month to month, week to week, some of these kinds of things happening and can track them and understand them and question them and research them. At the same time, other stakeholders could be engaged as well. Do they even understand that this is a possible potential problem from an ethical standpoint and ultimately from their project success standpoint? Where is the organization vulnerable in terms of schedule management capabilities? Policies and processes may have some shortfalls that could be shored up to help mitigate the potential for gaming. There's no shortage of a need for continuous improvement. Maybe this topic is addressed in training courses. That's what was done in prior organizations that I was affiliated with. Maybe it's a topic for integrated baseline reviews, just to create the awareness. The topic of a scheduled peer review, let's address it there, or in a knowledge forum to try to get the word out, to sensitize the community that this could happen. Let's be on the lookout for it. I'm a big advocate of independent review, as I've mentioned, and so are reviewers familiar with the potential that could go on, specifically these kinds of things. I might say, and I think I did say earlier, that we've looked at the scheduling dimension, but gaming is not unheard of in other areas, earned value management, risk management, and so forth. In fact, this session that you're looking at originated as a subset from a more broader treatment of the subject across the project or across the organization from an earned value perspective. And maybe I should have started with it first, but certainly that, and I've mentioned it a couple of times, working together. If there is a good teamwork and a good, healthy working relationship between two parties, customer and supplier, project office and product lead, whatever level, that can go a long way to mitigate the gaming and perhaps eliminate it from happening at all. So I have truly rushed through that, and I'd like to come back to Jan, who I think may have some questions and comments that we can address. And so, Jan, I'll turn that over to you.
All right. Thank you, Walt. I guess We have 2 questions received so far on the chat box. Number 1 question is from Charles. You are speaking to AACE International, so why not reference the AACE canons of ethics?
Well, let me respond to that. I had considered that. However, I was not as familiar with the organization, and perhaps, Jan, I should have reached out to you because I really didn't, I wasn't sure I even had the most up-to-date version. So I used the PMI code just as a simple illustration, and so I really have no excuse other than to say I used PMI and not AACE.
All right, thank you. Question number 2 from Dan. If a member of the integrated project team notes that there are examples of scheduled gaming as described in this talk, what are the practical possible course or courses of actions available to this individual?
So let me be sure I understand that. In other words, if some instances of gaming are uncovered, what do you do about it? Is that the basic question?
Dan, are you here to
Yeah,
respond?
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting. The short answer is yes. What does one do if one sees examples as you describe? What can someone practically do? Over.
Okay, well, let me try to respond to that. And there may be several things. First of all, it's to document that, to truly understand what the issue could be. Now, I think a technique that's worked reasonably well in the past is that it may begin at the working level where, for example, if the scheduler or schedule analyst in the case of a supplier or contractor and customer organization, let's say the customer identifies these potential gaming issues, that at the working level, there could be a discussion with the planner on the other side, on the supplier side, to understand, is this an error? Why do you have that? Let them explain that first and begin there, and perhaps begin to track these over time. So I would say that starting at the working level, if it's significant enough, Dan, and everyone, where this is a fairly global type of an issue where it may suggest some violation of a perhaps a contractual requirement, and here's an example, and this goes back to one of our first 2 abuse techniques, where we had an organization that had planned a number of items, deliverables, other things that were required. They were planning, scheduling those to be done by the preliminary design review. Let's just say a half a dozen were not getting done. They were going to be late. So they disconnected the logic of those tasks and connected them further down the line. So the course of action, well, first of all, these were detected at the working level by the planner, actually by an independent review team planner and or analyst. And so the question then was elevated in that case to the independent review team. Are these needed for this review? What then also from a contractual standpoint and a system engineering standpoint, what is needed for this review? And then finally, to go to the supplier and ask, why are these items, why have these been changed? So in that illustration, there's like a sort of line of questioning that begins internally, maybe at a working level. It may have to be elevated higher up within the project. And so it's somewhat of a, partially, Dan, a sort of a forensic analysis, almost some detective work that needs to be done. If it gets really beyond that, though, if this is truly becoming perhaps a confrontational type of item, the issue may have to be raised above the local project level to the program or the institution's management to address this with that supplier. That's kind of a, you know, a shortish answer to that, if that helps any.
Very much so. Thank you. I fully realize there's no absolute or pat answer to this, but I appreciate your detail on that. Over.
Okay. All right, Jan, any other questions or comments?
I guess this is a comment, not so much a question per se, from Marina. She said sometimes the project asks do whatever, but don't show any delay.
Okay, and we sort of had a somewhat of an example of that a couple of pages back, where actually right up front we had one of our quotes here. That last quote, similar to what that comment is about, where the planner, in this case the project manager, directed his or her planner to just go fix the schedule, so make the slack go away. In that particular case, the planner was extremely concerned, very perplexed, very stressed, and went to his functional management about that. And then, so the functional manager in that case did have a discussion with the project manager. Now, it didn't necessarily cure things overnight, but part of this was education, if you will, if not training for the project manager, that, you know, we don't do these things here. This is not the way this organization works, but there will always be, I think, some outliers to deal with.
All right. We just received another question from Vaughn. Will this presentation be emailed to the attendees? For now, I don't plan on just send a plain email to everyone, but if you are interested in receiving a copy, please email me, and then I will get a final versions, and then Mr. Majorowicz is okay that I share that with you.
That is perfectly fine. Jan, anyone would like that, it's maybe a, you know, top level desktop reference if you'd like.
All right. Another questions from Chandrasekhar. When updating the actual progress, is it mandatory to keep controlled schedule, adjusting remaining duration to keep the completion as same as baseline completion, or not?
Well, I think we might be wandering into a more broader operational type of question with, you know, just proper scheduling techniques, maybe not so much gaming, but I think if I can try to repeat that question back a little differently, it was, are we asking if the duration has grown, do we adjust the future, the task's duration to get it back in line to the baseline? Is that kind of what the question was, Jan?
I would like to request, yes. Oh, yeah, he sent it, yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's part of this. On the one hand, if our duration for our task, it's underway and it's grown, why is that? There may be a pretty good reason why. If we want to bring it back in line, then it may mean having to do something to take some action to do so, such as perhaps we need to add a little more help in terms of additional resources. Perhaps we, depending on the nature of the task, if this is a real big thing that, are we doing something in-house that we can contract out, bring it in earlier? Can we do work at a lower level in parallel that was in series? So I think that the answer is, in my judgment, what are the legitimate ways of bringing the schedule back in relative to the duration and not have to game it so it just gives the appearance of being on track? So that would be my my view, just from a quick feedback point of view.
All right. Is there any more questions? That would be the last one I see from the chat box. All right. I see no question, no hands raised. Is that- I guess that might be a conclude. Before we conclude our meeting, I would like to make a small announcement. This is something new to the chapter that hasn't done before. So I would like to invite you to participate on a short survey that I sent in a chat box. If you want to receive a copy of your attendance certs for these technical sections, please follow the link. It's very brief questions on emails, your names, and please let me know if that works or doesn't work for you. This is something new. I just want to provide that to you if you would like to receive for the continuing education units. All right. Thank you very much. Mr. Moravec gave us a great presentation today.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. Always glad to help, and wish everyone well. And Jan, thank you for your help in getting things set up.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess we're signing off then.
Yes, I will stay here for one more minute for folks that wants to use that link
Okay.
in the chat box. But thank you all.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.